Hi, everyone. Bob Bordone here, coming to you at the end of the longest shutdown of the United States government in the nearly 250-year life of this country. So, in the past few days, there have been tons of commentary and postmortem about what happened that led 8 Democrats to defect and join the Republicans and break the filibuster to bring an end to the government shutdown. Today, I'm going to try to avoid the politics. I'm going to try to avoid a lot of the post-mortem about who won and who lost and try to talk about this negotiation, failure, success, breakdown, but final deal from the perspective of what you can learn as a negotiator. So let's go. So here we are at the end of the government shutdown, and our government is reopening at least until January 31st. What negotiation lessons can we take from a shutdown that brought airports to its knees, that prevented SNAP benefits from going to millions of people, and that in the end, arguably, won the Democrats almost nothing in the negotiation? I want to offer lessons in 3 different areas related to negotiation. So first, let's talk at the level of tactics. Essentially, what happened that led to this shutdown is that the Republicans put a partisan bill forward, and a bill that failed in the Senate and barely passed in the House. And then, unlike what typically would happen, they basically said, it's take it or leave it. We're not going to negotiate. So from a negotiation perspective, we saw the use of a take it or leave it tactic. In response, at least at start, the Democrats decided to leave it. So what they did was a game of chicken. And once you enter into a game of chicken, it's typically extremely hard to get out of that game, short of somebody being able to come in and build what we would call a golden bridge for each side. By a golden bridge, an opportunity for each side to really see this as a win. And as the shutdown loomed longer and longer, it became pretty clear that golden bridges were not going to be built. And so ultimately what happened is a number of Democrats actually caved in. So what does this mean? So as a negotiator, when you are faced with take it or leave it, when you decide to play the other side's game, it almost always is an escalation. So the better advice, the advice that actually can help you move forward, would be, how can I reframe that take it or leave it move into a conversation about the party's interests, into a conversation about relevant criteria, or into some kind of conversation about more creative options? Now, in a situation like this, it was extremely hard to do because, in fact, there was no real interlocutor. But in that case, the question still becomes, should we choose chicken? And in this case, it seems that choosing chicken is an extremely high risk move if you are uncertain that you're going to be able to hold your coalition together. And ultimately, the challenge with the Democrats here is that their coalition was always, from the get-go, a bit more flimsy and less strong than the Republicans. And so this leads to the second area I want to talk about from a negotiation perspective, which is the strategy for building coalitions. So the first thing to say about coalitions, lots of times people assume, coalition building is almost always a good idea in negotiation. But the fact of the matter is that's not necessarily so. In negotiation, if you can get something done on your own without building a coalition, that has considerable advantages. Well, why is that the case? Well, first of all, it takes a lot of time to build a coalition. Second, in the process of building the coalition, you are always making concessions to hold that coalition together. Third, coalitions are inherently unstable. Now, in the case, of course, of this partisan negotiation, it was necessary in order to be able to be effective with the Republicans that the Democratic leadership had to build a coalition. The challenge here was that it was inherently unstable. And so even from the get-go, there were a number of Democrats, perhaps most prominently Senator Fetterman of Pennsylvania, who they could not get on board. What's really interesting from a negotiation analytic perspective is that if you look at the people who actually broke away from the coalition, they are, in many respects, the most likely candidates. So who were they? 5 of those people were people who came from swing states. So the individual interest of these senators ultimately was more important than the collective interest. They were thinking about their reelection. And as the situation toward Thanksgiving, around SNAP benefits, around people not make it home for the holidays worsened, they saw their reelection prospects fading. What's interesting, though, is that the other senators, actually 2 of the other 8 senators who ultimately defected, are senators who have chosen to retire. And in some sense, my guess is that they realized that even though there would be political costs for defecting, the interest in having Americans get home for Thanksgiving on time and having SNAP benefits go to people who are hungry was so important in the short term that it made sense to defect at this moment. And because they don't have to worry about reelection, they can make that choice to jump. Of course, the last senator who defected is from another swing state and is actually an independent. It's Senator Angus King of Maine. And as an independent, even though he organizes mostly with the Democrats, he occasionally will make these maverick decisions, which is part of the reason why he identifies as an independent and not as a Democrat. Now, let me offer the last thing I want to talk about here, because it's so important in negotiation and so often overlooked, which is the issue of timing. And both the Democrats and, in some sense, the Republicans have used timing at various moments in this negotiation to their advantage. So let's start with the Democrats. In fact, the initial decision to say no to the Republican bill proposal was based on a timing consideration. The Democrats knew that healthcare companies, the time for open enrollment, would happen at the end of October. And because the Republican proposed budget ended ACA subsidies that would ultimately result in incredible increases in Americans' healthcare beginning January 1st, the Democrats felt if we hold up the budget here, the Republicans' hand is going to be forced, because the last thing they want on their record is that they're responsible for sometimes doubling the cost of healthcare for upwards of perhaps 40 million Americans. That's why they decided to take a stand here and not in March. Now, ultimately, that ended up, in the sense, being a bit of a backfire. And so we get to this point where actually healthcare premiums have been released. There's still no negotiation happening. And suddenly, there's another timing issue. So what's happening is, as the shutdown is going longer, more and more air traffic controllers are calling in sick or literally retiring, forcing the government to make major cutbacks on airline schedules. And of course, what's looming is Thanksgiving. And as terrible as ending SNAP benefits is, and even as terrible as increases in healthcare premiums on many Americans, one thing that affects huge number of Americans, and that's right in their face, is, are they going to make it home for Thanksgiving? Perhaps the most important and most American of all holidays. And so this ends up forcing another deadline, but it's a deadline now that really invites the game of chicken. Who is going to get blamed for your son, your daughter, your cousin, your grandma, your brother not making it home for Thanksgiving? And so in some sense, right, that is what causes some of these Democrats to actually blink. But the way they blink is quite strategic because they set up yet another timing consideration. And the other timing consideration is when the compromise actually ends, which is January 31st. So this is a short-term funding bill. What it means is that Americans are going to see an increase in their healthcare premiums, that they will see on their bill for the first time in January. They'll still make it home for Thanksgiving, but they're going to see for the first time in January this increase on their healthcare benefits. And then the government won't be funded as of January 31st. And so in some sense here, the Democrats are feeling that they're able to kind of claim that they save the immediate holidays, that they're helping people who are at the brink of hunger with SNAP benefits, but they haven't funded the government beyond the holidays. And at the moment when they're able to say, look at your healthcare bill, dear Republicans, Democrats, Americans, and that is on the Republican budget. And oh, by the way, if we can't solve this, the government closes again, it creates another crisis. So hard to know at this point whether that strategic use of the deadline is going to work. But I think the lesson for you is that strategic use of action forcing events or deadlines can be very helpful as a negotiation strategy. Okay, so who knows what's going to happen with the budget going forward, but there are some negotiation lessons we can take away. First, when someone's using a tactic like take it or leave it, if you decide to leave it, you are in a game of chicken. And once you cave in a game of chicken, all it's going to do is encourage the same behavior from the other side. So a better strategy is to try to really reframe this into a conversation about legitimate interests or appropriate criteria or options. Second, sometimes you need to build a coalition in a negotiation, but building a coalition is always a second choice. If you can get it done on your own, you should. And if you can't, keep in mind that coalitions are inherently unstable and take time and energy to maintain. Third, in negotiation, take advantage of deadlines and timing in a way that will strategically work to your advantage. Before you go, be sure to subscribe so you never miss more negotiation lessons like this one. Want to be a better negotiator? Watch this next video.